The Majority Report with Sam Cedar.
It is Monday, December 30th, 2019. My name is Sam Cedar. This is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live to tape steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America. That would be downtown Brooklyn, USA. Folks, best of 2019. We're all on vacation. You still get to hear some great shows. Sam, it's a podcast. I would go back and listen to it if I wanted to. No, you wouldn't. Not on this program. We have what is known as a short tail. Now, even though we have interviews that other shows would consider evergreen for years and years and years, we do more in a month than these shows do in a year. It's true. Think about it. It's true. It's making me nauseous thinking about it, actually. But so we know that you forget these interviews, or maybe you didn't hear them the first time around, and I can't bear to let that happen. Now, I got about 20 on the list that I wanted to play, so we didn't have time for that. So we had to edit it down again. Believe me, brutal. But nevertheless, we've done it. We've done it for you. Why? Because we love you. Today on the program, from March 19th, 2019, Johann Hari, author of Lost Connections, Uncovering the Real Causes of Depression and the Unexpected Solutions. Great book. And then we have some fun half stuff that we're doing for free. We've opened the floodgates of the fun half. And we invite you in as a way of saying, hey, thank you for your support in 2019. And if you're not a member, look at what you've been missing, because there's going to be a lot more of this in 2020. And believe me, it's going to be crazy. So check it out. You can become a member at jointhemajorityreport.com. Also, we got the AM Quickies going, amquickie.com. We're updating that. That's a live show that we do, or I should say, current. We're doing it every day, basically, on vacation. I'm doing it every day on vacation for the most part. A couple of days off. Why am I doing that? I don't know. I am. Got to keep up with this stuff. But you can support the show. Join themajorityreport.com and sit back, listen to Johann Hari, and then stick around for some of the freebie fun half. Cedar on the Majority Report. It is a pleasure to welcome back to the program journalist, New York Times bestselling author of his last book, Chasing the Scream. Now for his latest, which is out in paperback, I think, in just a couple of months, Lost Connections, Uncovering the Real Causes of Depression and the Unexpected Solutions. Johann Hari, welcome back to the show.
Oh, hey, Sam. I'm so happy to be back with you.
So, all right, let's just start with that as a follow-up to Chasing the Scream, which you wrote in terms of addiction. Basically, the argument, and I want to paint with too broad a brush, but the argument in Chasing the Scream was that connection is more or less the opposite of addiction. What brought you to Lost Connections?
Yeah, it's a good question. There were these two mysteries that were really hanging over me. And if I'm honest, I was quite afraid to look into them. And they were very connected in some ways. I use that word not ironically, with some of the things that I've been writing about in Chasing the Scream. So the first mystery is I'm 40 years old, and every year that I've been alive, depression and anxiety have increased here in the United States and across the Western world. And I wanted to understand why. Why are so many people finding it so much harder to get through the day? And why is it going up year after year to the point where now last week the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, announced we now have the highest level of suicide in American history, and that doesn't include opioid-related overdoses, which are also at epidemic levels. So what's going on here? One of the reasons I was frightened to look into this is because of the second mystery, which is when I was a teenager, I remember going to my doctor and explaining that I had this feeling like pain was leaking out of me. I couldn't control it. I couldn't regulate it. I didn't understand what was going on, and I felt quite ashamed of it. And my doctor told me a story that I now realize wasn't totally wrong, but was really oversimplified. My doctor said, we know why people get depressed like this. It's because there's a problem in their brain. Some people have a natural chemical imbalance. Some people are just lacking a chemical called serotonin that makes people feel good. All we need to do is give you this drug, you're going to be fine. So I started taking an antidepressant called Paxil, and I did get a really significant boost from it. A few months later, this feeling of pain came back. So I went back to my doctor. He said, clearly, I didn't give you a high enough dose. I was given a higher dose. Again, I felt a boost. Again, this feeling of pain came back. And I was in this cycle of jacking up the dose more and more until for 13 years, I was taking the maximum possible dose, at the end of which I was still depressed, and I seemed to be surrounded by more and more people who were becoming depressed. And I kind of, part of me thought, if it was just a problem in our brains, why would it be rising so much? But at the same time, when you've got a story about your pain, even if it's not working very well for you, and that story was not working very well for me, at least you feel like you know where you are. I was really reluctant. There was this moment when I felt like if I explore these different ways of thinking, it's almost like letting the pain off the leash, right? If the pain is like a wild animal, if you let it off the leash, you don't know where you are, you don't know how it will attack you. But I kind of steeled myself to go on this journey. So I ended up going on a really big journey. I wanted to use my training in the social sciences to go and meet the leading scientists in the world who've written about depression and anxiety and how to solve them. And I wanted to sit with people who have really, really different perspectives as well, from an Amish village in Indiana, because the Amish have very low levels of depression, to a city in Brazil that banned advertising to see if that would make people feel better, to a lab in Baltimore where they were giving people psychedelics to see if that would help. And I learned a huge number of things, a lot of which I think connect with the themes that you report on in the Majority Report a huge amount of the time. I learned that there's scientific evidence for 9 causes of depression and anxiety. 2 of them are indeed in our biology. Your genes can make you more sensitive to this, and there are real brain changes that happen when you become depressed that can make it harder to get out. But most of those 9 factors that are causing depression and anxiety that I write about in Lost Connections are not in our biology. They are factors in the way we live. They're things that you cover all the time, Sam. And once you understand those factors, it opens up a new set of solutions that should be offered as part of an expanded menu alongside the option of chemical antidepressants.
It's there's total coincidence, but just a couple of days ago, maybe was it I can't remember if it was last week. I have no recollection of time. We had Rutger Bregman on, who
my friend, I love him.
Yeah, well, his book Utopia for Realists. There's some prescriptions that you talk about in your book that he talks about in Utopia for Realists, and the notion of a concept of general happiness. And there are overlaps here, and I have a feeling we'll bump into those. But just as you mentioned, things that you talk about on this program, we literally were touching on sort of a more sort of like policy oriented, but in many respects, many of the things that you're talking about are arguably a function of our the capitalist system and the failures in some instances of the capitalist system maybe not necessarily inherent in capitalism, or I should say necessary to have along with capitalism, but maybe come. But before you, let's get to some of those and. I don't know perhaps like the I don't want to go through each one of the causes, but let's start, since we were talking about that disconnection from meaningful work. I mean, Bregman cited Graeber's work on bullshit jobs, and but let's talk about what you found in terms of this idea, and this is all premised on the idea that we may have within us a predisposition to depression, but that theoretically should not have changed over time in terms of the amount of people. But there could be environmental factors that promote this innate potential to sadly, to flourish in this instance.
Yeah. Some people, everyone knows, some people find it easier to put on weight and some people find it harder to put on weight. But everyone across American society has put on more weight over the last 40 years, right? A similar thing has happened with depression. Some people will find it easier to become depressed than others, but because of changes in the society, it's massively exploded. So work is a great example. I noticed that lots of the people I know who are depressed and anxious, their depression and anxiety focuses around their work. So I started to think, well, what's the evidence for this? Maybe the people I know are unusual. I looked at the best research on it. So Gallup, the opinion poll company, did a massive study of how do people feel about their work. It turned out 13% of us, 1-3%, like our work most of the time. 63% are what they called sleepworking. You don't like it, you don't hate it, you just kind of get through the day. And 24% of people hate and fear their jobs. I was quite struck by that. That means most of us, in fact, 87% of us, don't like the thing we're doing most of the time. And this thing that we don't like doing is spreading over more and more of the day. The average person now answers their first work email at 7:43 a.m. and leaves work at 7:15 p.m. I started to ask, could this be having some effect on our mental health? I learned that there was an amazing man who I then went to interview, an Australian social scientist called Professor Michael Marmot, who made a really important breakthrough on this in the 1970s. Professor Marmot discovered the key factor, it's not the only one, but the key factor that causes depression at work. If you go to work tomorrow and you have low or no control over your work, you are much more likely to become depressed and anxious. I think this is related to something that goes deeper than work, although it's a key part of this. Everyone listening to Majority Report knows that they have natural physical needs. Obviously, you need food, you need water, you need shelter, you need clean air, over time you need sex. If I took those things away from you, you'd be in real trouble real fast. But there's equally strong evidence that all human beings have natural psychological needs. You need to feel you belong. You need to feel your life has meaning and purpose. You need to feel that people see you and value you. You need to feel we've got a future that makes sense. And this culture we built is good at lots of things. I had to go to the dentist the other day. I'm glad to be alive in 2019. But we have been getting less and less good at meeting these deep underlying psychological needs. So think about being controlled at work. If you are controlled all the time, if you're like a robot on a line, you can't construct meaning out of your work. But as human beings, we need to feel that what we're doing with our hours and our days are meaningful, that we're not just drones, that we're not just controlled by somebody else. So at first, I actually misunderstood what Professor Marmot was saying, right? So I thought the implication of all this evidence was, okay, you've got this elite 13% at the top who get to have nice jobs they control. And then everyone else is condemned to this misery. And I thought about my family, right? My grandmother's job was to clean toilets. My dad was a bus driver. My brother is an Uber driver. I thought, wait, are we just saying all these people are condemned to this misery? And Professor Marmot explained to me, it's not the work that makes you depressed. It's being controlled at work. And there's a solution for that. So I went to Baltimore to meet a woman called Meredith Keogh. And Meredith used to go to bed every Sunday night, just sick with anxiety. She worked in an office. As Meredith would tell you, it wasn't the worst office job in the world. She wasn't being bullied or harassed or anything, but it was really monotonous. And Meredith couldn't bear the thought this was going to be the next 40 years of her life until she retired. So one day with her husband, Josh, she did this quite bold thing. When people hear this, they're going to think I'm saying you should do this too. They're going to think I can't do this. And they're right. This is an argument for a structural change. So Josh had worked in bike stores in Baltimore since he was a teenager. And, that's insecure, controlled work. You have no rights or very few rights. One day, Josh was sitting there in the bike store with his friends. They're fixing their bikes. And one of them just said, what does our boss actually do? They didn't hate their boss. He wasn't a particularly bad boss, but they were like, we seem to fix all the bikes and this other dude seems to make all the money. That's such a good deal for us. Josh and his friends decided they were going to, and Meredith, decided they were going to set up a bike store of their own that worked on a different principle. So the previous place they worked was a corporation. This is a very recent human invention, right? Everyone listening knows how a corporation works. You've got the boss at the top, who's the dictator. And sometimes they're a nice dictator, and sometimes they're Kim Jong-un, but you've got no say over that. Sometimes they listen, sometimes they don't. But if you don't obey the dictator, ultimately you're out of the organization, right? They decided they were going to set up a bike store that worked on an older American idea. The store they set up, Baltimore Bicycle Works, is a democratic cooperative, right? It's not a corporation. They don't have a boss. They take the decisions about the business together by voting once every couple of weeks. They share out the profit. They share out the good tasks and the shitty tasks, so no one gets stuck with the shitty tasks. If anyone wants to change the business, they can try and persuade their colleagues to do it, so no one is like a drone. You've got agency. And one of the things that was so striking to me, spending time in Baltimore Bicycle Works, was how many people there talked about how they had been depressed and anxious before, but were not depressed and anxious now, which is totally in line with Professor Marmot's findings, right? It's not like they quit their jobs fixing bikes and went off to become like Beyonce's backing singers, right? They fixed bikes before, they fix bikes now. What's the difference? Now they have control over their work. How many people do you know who are depressed and anxious at the moment, who would feel really differently if they had work that they controlled with their colleagues, where they had a say, where no one got stuck with the shitty tasks all the time? That's a very different way of spending our time. Now, that's a big structural change. There are lots of smaller things I talk about in Lost Connections that would deal with depression. But I would argue that move from a society dominated by corporations to every business being a democratic cooperative, and by the way, it's even more economically efficient. A study at Cornell University found that democratic businesses grow on average 4 times faster. That move, that shift, giving people back control over their work, that is an antidepressant. Anything that reduces depression should be regarded as an antidepressant. For some people, that will include chemicals, but precisely because the causes of depression are much deeper. So control and humiliation at work are a big factor. It's one of the 9 causes that I talk about. You can see, because the problem is deeper than our biology, the solutions have to be wider than just looking at our biology.
Yeah, and that's so. Let me just ask you, in terms of like that notion of we are less good at meeting our psychological needs, right? That
yeah.
Is that a function that we are less good at it now, or is it that the distance between our psychological needs and how society is structured, the gulf has widened?
The society has changed. I'll give you a specific example because it can sound a bit weird to people in the abstract. This is the loneliest society in human history. There's a study that asks Americans, how many close friends do you have who you could turn to in a crisis? And when they started doing it years ago, the most common answer was 5. Today, the most common answer, not the average, but the most common answer is none. There are more Americans who have nobody to turn to when things go wrong than any other option. Half of all Americans asked how many people know you well, say nobody. And I spent a lot of time interviewing an amazing man, Professor John Cacioppo, in Chicago, who's the leading expert in the world on loneliness. And he said to me, why are we alive? Why do we exist, right? Everyone listening to this show, why are you alive? One of the key reasons is that our ancestors on the savannas of Africa were really good at one thing. They weren't faster than the animals they took down. They weren't bigger than the animals they took down, but they were much better at banding together into groups and cooperating. Just like bees evolved to live in a hive, humans evolved to live in a tribe. And we are the first humans ever to disband our tribes. I would argue that's partly because, not entirely, there's lots of things going on, but because of this neoliberal, ultra-capitalist story we've been told that you are a selfish economic maximizer. That is what human beings are. That's how you should treat yourself. That's how you should treat other people. We have structured the entire economy and society on that principle. And it's like putting a foot into a shoe that doesn't fit. That's not our nature. That's not who we are, right? And so one of the things I wanted to think about is, again, that can seem like such a big, overpowering thing. What is the solution? And one of the heroes of my book, Lost Connections, is an amazing doctor who found one of the solutions to this. So his name is Sam Everington. He's from a poor part of East London, where I'm from, as you can tell from my weird Downton Abbey accent. And Sam was really uncomfortable because he had loads of patients coming to him with terrible depression and anxiety. And like me, he's not opposed to chemical antidepressants. He thinks they have some role to play. But he could see two things. Firstly, they were depressed and anxious for perfectly understandable reasons. Their pain made sense, like they were really lonely. And secondly, most of the people he gave chemical antidepressants to got some relief, but ultimately became depressed again. So one day, Sam had an idea. A woman came to see him called Lisa Cunningham, who I got to know later. Lisa had been shut away in her home with crippling depression and anxiety for 7 years. And Sam said to Lisa, don't worry, I'll carry on giving you these drugs, but I'm also going to prescribe something else. There was an area behind the suite of doctors' offices that was known as Dog Shit Alley. It was just like scrubland, basically. Sam said to Lisa, what I'd like you to do is come and turn out a couple of times a week at Dog Shit Alley. I'm going to come too because I've been quite anxious. We're going to meet with a group of other depressed and anxious people, and we're going to find something to do together. The first time the group met, Lisa was literally physically sick with anxiety. But the group starts talking. They're like, what can we do together? They decided, these are inner city East London people like me. They didn't know anything about gardening. They're like, okay, we'll teach ourselves gardening. They start to watch YouTube clips. They start to read books. They start to get their fingers in the soil. They start to learn the rhythms of the seasons. There's a lot of evidence that exposure to the natural world is a really powerful antidepressant. But even more importantly, they start to form a tribe. They start to form a group. They start to care about each other. They start to do what human beings do when we care about each other. They start to solve each other's problems. The way Lisa put it to me, as the garden began to bloom, we began to bloom. There was a study in Norway of a very similar program that found it was more than twice as effective as chemical antidepressants. I think for an obvious reason. This is something I saw all over the world, from Sydney to Sao Paulo to San Francisco. The most effective strategies for dealing with depression and anxiety are the ones that deal with the underlying reasons why we feel this way in the first place.
Do you think that the I mean, it's interesting because the alienating parts of our society. I mean, two things occur to me. One is one of the statistics I've seen is that we also are turning out, something to the effect of like in 1950, people were asked the question, do you feel special? And only about 10% of the people said that they felt special. And now I think younger people today, 80% of them think that they're special. But that specialness is also, in some respects, pushing the idea of the individual above that of the collective on some level. I mean, how much of that, like, where is that line, right? Where this idea of like, you're not quite as, that the society that teaches you that you're particularly unique also is teaching you simultaneously that you're particularly isolated in some way.
I think this relates to one of the hardest causes of depression. There were two causes of depression and anxiety that were really hard for me to learn about. One was childhood trauma. We can talk about that later if you want. Yeah. But because that had played out a lot in my life. But the other was this one. And, everyone listening to your show knows junk food has taken over our diets and made us physically sick, right? As someone who basically lived on KFC in my 20s, I don't say that with any sense of superiority. But what's fascinating is something very similar has happened with our minds. A kind of junk values have taken over our minds and made us mentally sick. And this is very related to the kind of neoliberal capitalism that you were talking about. So for thousands of years, philosophers have said, if you think life is about money and status and showing off, you're going to feel like shit, right? That's not an exact quote from Confucius, but that is the gist of what he said, right? But nobody had scientifically investigated this until an incredible man I got to know called Professor Tim Kasser at Knox College in Illinois, who's been investigating this for the last 25 years. And he showed a few really important things. One is, the more you think life is driven, I'd explain it slightly differently. Imagine you play the piano, right? If you play the piano in the morning because you love it and it gives you joy, that's what's called an intrinsic reason for playing the piano. You're not doing it to get anything out of it. You're doing it because that is the experience you love. Okay, now imagine you play the piano not because you love it, but because your parents are massively pressuring you to be a piano maestro because that's their dream for you. Or you play the piano in a dive bar that you hate to make the rent. Or you play it to post the clips on Instagram to impress a woman, right? Those would be extrinsic reasons to play the piano. You're not doing it because that gives you a sense of joy. You're doing it to get something out of it further down the line. Now, we're all a mixture of these two kinds of motive, right? You have to be to survive. But Professor Kasser showed some really interesting things. Firstly, the more you are driven by these extrinsic values, what I came to think of as the equivalent of junk food, kind of junk values, the more you're driven by money and status and how you look to other people, the more likely you are to become depressed and anxious by a really quite significant amount. I think it relates to this question about needs. That is not a way of living that meets your deeper needs. He also showed, as a society, as a culture, we have become much more driven by these junk values. And in some ways, at first when I learned this, I'm like, yeah, but this is almost like banal, right? Everyone listening to your show knows they're not going to lie on their deathbed and think about all the likes they got on Instagram and all the shoes they bought. They're going to think about moments of love and meaning and connection. But as Professor Kasser put it to me, we live in a machine that is designed to get us to neglect what is important about life. More 18-month-old children in the United States know what the McDonald's M means than know their own last name. From the moment you're born, you are immersed in a machinery that tells you, what is life about? If you don't feel good, go shopping, buy, display it to other people so they'll go shopping and they'll feel better. We create an entire story about happiness that doesn't work. This is a very deliberately created story about happiness. You read the advertising literature, they literally call them manufactured wants. And the reason I say this was hard for me to learn is because, when I used to get depressed, when I would feel these painful feelings come, very often my recourse was a kind of junk values solution, right? I would earn more, I would buy shit I didn't need, I would show off, I would have some kind of achievement, or I would do someone else down. And I realize now when I think about that, I can't find this clip, but years ago I remember seeing a clip of a silent movie star, I think it was Buster Keaton, where he's sinking in quicksand, his legs are sinking in quicksand. So to get out, he reaches in with his arms to pull out his legs, which of course means he sinks faster. So then he reaches in with his head to pull out his arms, and then he's completely gone. And I realized that's kind of what I would do, right? I was seeking happiness in the wrong places in the way that our society tells us to. It made me feel awful. It's not the only thing that was going on, but it was one of the things that made me feel awful. And instead of trying to break with that logic, I would double down on that logic. And I was sunk, right?
I mean, that is the right. That is the sort of the classic neoliberal, function is you rely on the marketplace, it creates a problem, and then you rely on the marketplace to solve the problem that was created by the market in the first place, and
Absolutely.
so on and so on.
That's such a good way of putting it.
When you talked about tribalism too, I wonder if the breakdown that you talk about, or that sort of that sense that, I don't have five people I could go to like we did in a time before. I have no one to turn to, and we have a physiological need, I guess you could say it, to be part of a tribe. I mean, I can't help but think that, we're living in a very strange era where tribalism plays out around sort of some signifiers. They don't necessarily have any direct meaning. I mean, I think one of the things that's been fascinating about this period of our politics anyways, in terms of what I've seen on the right and left to a certain extent, but more so on the right, but maybe that's just where I'm situated to be able to see it, is that some of these signifiers completely irrelevant, where, the most closely held belief 16 months later can be completely jettisoned. But the idea is you got to maintain the tribe. And I wonder if, like, the loss of that tribe in a sort of smaller, more impactful on our actual lives way has led to a compulsion for, sort of joining other groups in other ways.
I think you're totally right. I think all the time about this woman that I met in Cleveland in the run-up to the 2016 election. I was with the LA LGBT Centre, a wonderful person called Dave Fleischer, and we were trying to get out the vote. And there was this street we were on, a third of the houses were abandoned, a third were demolished, and a third still had people living in them. And we knock on this door, and there's a woman who answered, who I would have guessed from looking at her was 60. I discovered from talking to her, she was the same age as me. I was 37 at the time. Right. And we're chatting, and she was quite articulate. She was extremely angry. She wasn't going to vote for Hillary. And she made this verbal mistake that's really stayed with me. She was talking about what the area used to be like for her parents and grandparents. And she talks about how they left school when they were 16, they got good jobs. And she meant to say, when I was young. What she actually said is, when I was alive. Right. And it really knocked me back, right? And it's like that's how a lot of people have been made to feel in this culture. It's one of the reasons why you've got the rise of people like this woman just saying, well, just burn the house down, right? Now, don't get me wrong, I'm desperately trying to stop people voting for Donald Trump, and that woman's problems will be made significantly worse by the rise of by President Trump and his policies. But I do think we have to understand where this is coming from. You know, I think there was one person who really helped me to think differently about this. Two people, actually. So I went to interview this South African psychiatrist called Derek Summerfield, who happened to be in Cambodia in 2001 when they first introduced chemical antidepressants in that country. And the local doctors, the Cambodians, had never heard of these drugs, right? So they were like, what are they? And he explained. And the Cambodians said to him, oh, we don't need them. We've already got antidepressants. And he said, what do you mean? He thought they were going to talk about some kind of herbal remedy like St. John's wort or ginkgo biloba or something. Instead, they told him a story. There was a farmer in their community who one day stood on he worked in the rice fields, and one day he stood on a landmine left over from the American invasion of Southeast Asia, and he got his leg blown off. So they gave him an artificial leg, and he goes back to work in the rice fields a few months later. But the guy, apparently it's incredibly painful to work underwater when you've got an artificial leg. I'm guessing it was pretty traumatic for obvious reasons. He's in the field where he got blown up. He starts to cry all day. After a while, he refuses to get out of bed. He's developed classic depression. The Cambodian doctor said, well, that's when we gave him an antidepressant. And Dr. Summerfield said, what? They explained that they went and sat with him. They listened to him. They realized that his pain made sense. They figured if they bought him a cow, he could become a dairy farmer. He wouldn't be in this position that was screwing him up so much. So they bought him a cow. Within a couple of weeks, his crying stopped. Within a month, his depression was gone. They said to Dr. Summerfield, so you see, doctor, that cow, that was an antidepressant. That's what you mean, right? Now, if you've been raised to think about depression the way we have, that it's entirely biological or overwhelmingly biological, that sounds like a bad joke. I went to my doctor for a cow. She gave me I went to my doctor for an antidepressant and she gave me a cow. But what those Cambodian doctors knew intuitively is what the leading medical body in the world, the World Health Organization, has been trying to tell us for years. If you're depressed, if you're anxious, you're not weak, you're not crazy, you're not a machine with broken parts. You're a human being with unmet needs. And what you need is practical help to get those needs met. The leading doctor at the United Nations on mental health said we need to talk less about chemical imbalances and more about power imbalances. I mean, think about it. Half of all Americans, through no fault of their own because of this insane transformation of the economy, have less than $500 in savings for when an emergency comes along. Well, of course they're going to be depressed in that situation. And then they go to their doctor and they're told, oh, there's just a problem in your brain. Now, I want to stress there are real biological contributions to depression and anxiety. Drugs can give some relief, but we've told this ludicrously simplistic story. The factors that cause depression and anxiety, for which there is enormous scientific evidence, have objectively gone up in many cases. And lo and behold, more people have in fact become depressed and anxious. And yet what we've done is we've told people a reductively biological story about that. And it's cut us off from hearing the signal, right? This depression, this anxiety, this addiction crisis, they are signals. They are telling us something. We've got to stop insulting the signal by saying it's a sign of weakness or craziness and start listening to that signal.
You early in the book, you write about the in the 70s where they had the checklist for reasons for depression, and I think one of them was like mourning Talk about that dynamic, how they sort of, if someone you knew died, they were like, oh, well, that's not actually, you don't have depression because you should be upset about that. But go ahead.
So this tells you something really profound about how we misunderstand pain in this culture. So in the 1970s, the American Psychiatric Association, the APA, decided they were going to standardize how they diagnose depression and anxiety across the country, which is a good idea. So they drew up, it's kind of simple, they just drew up a checklist of 10 symptoms, kind of obvious things like crying all the time, feeling life is not worth living. And they send them out to doctors all over the US and they say, if your patients show more than 5 of these 10 symptoms for more than 2 weeks, diagnose them as mentally ill, do what you can. So doctors start using this. But after a while, they come back and they go, look, we've got a bit of a problem here. If we use this guideline, we're going to have to diagnose every grieving person as mentally ill because this is how you feel when someone you love dies. And the APA were like, shit, that's not what we meant. So they added something that became known as the grief loophole. They said, okay, if anyone shows more than 5 of these 10 symptoms for more than 2 weeks, they're mentally ill, unless someone they love in their family has died in the last year, in which case they're not mentally ill. It's totally normal to feel like that. Don't pathologize them. But of course, that begs the question, well, hang on a minute. So this is a brain disease. This is just a problem in your brain that can just be identified on a checklist unless someone you love has died. Why is that the only situation where you're allowed to feel like this without being told you're mentally ill? Why not if you've lost your job? Why not if you've lost your home? Why not if you're stuck in a job you hate for 40 years? Everyone can fill in a load of scenarios. But that was such an inconvenient, as Dr. Johann Hari, who's one of the leading experts on this, put it to me, that requires you to look at context. We don't have a mental health system that is designed to look at context. We're designed to just identify things on a checklist. This was such an inconvenient conversation that the APA just got rid of the grief loophole. So now, if your child dies at 10 a.m. and you're still showing all the symptoms of grief at 10:30 a.m., you can be diagnosed as mentally ill. In fact, nearly 10% of all grieving parents are diagnosed and drugged in the first 48 hours after their child dies. And as Dr. Hari put it to me, this shows we just don't understand pain, right? Grief is not a mental illness. We grieve because we have loved. This is a necessary human response. And I think it tells us something really interesting and important, that grief and depression have the same symptoms. I think part of what depression is grief for your own life not going how it should. It's grief for your own needs not being met. Now, if you are, when someone we love dies, we can't fix that, right? We can hold the people who survive, we can honor the memory of the person who's died, but we can't bring back the dead. But when we're grieving for our own lives, we can together, not in this individualistic neoliberal way, but together as citizens, we can change these factors, right? You mentioned our mutual friend, Rutger Bregman, who's a wonderful person who I interviewed for my book, Lost Connections, because he's talked a lot about one of these key antidepressants, right? So we talked about the incredible financial insecurity that has spread across this culture, right? As wealth has been sucked up to the top, right? As Bernie says, the top 3 richest people in this country have more money than the bottom half of the country, right? The whatever it is, the 6 heirs of the Walmart fortune who did nothing to earn their money, their heirs have more than the bottom 100 million Americans. So in Canada, they did an experiment with what we can do about that. In the early 1970s, the Canadian government chose, genuinely at random, a town in Manitoba called Dauphin. And they said to a huge number of people in that town, okay, guys, from now on, we're going to give you a guaranteed minimum income. There's nothing you have to do in return for it. And there's nothing you can do apart from going to prison that means that we'll take it away from you. We just want you to have a good, secure life. It was the equivalent, converted into US dollars and converted into today's money, of $12,000 a year. So not so much that you're going to live well, but you're not going to be homeless if you've got $12,000 a year. And this was monitored to see what happened. A wonderful person who I interviewed called Dr. Evelyn Forget did the best research on this. Loads of things happened, but to me, the most important is there was a really big fall in mental health problems across the board. Mental health problems that were so severe People had to be shut away in psychiatric hospitals. That alone fell by 9% in 3 years, right? Now, in some ways, this is an insight that's a kind of no shit Sherlock insight. Being financially insecure makes you feel terrible, and dealing with that financial insecurity makes you feel better. As Dr. Forget puts it to me, a universal basic income is an antidepressant, right? But this requires us to expand our concept, both of what causes depression and of what an antidepressant is. My argument in Lost Connections is anything that reduces depression should be regarded as an antidepressant, right?
And to some degree, right, there is an incentive by forces in society, and I'm not saying that it's a plot, but there is incentives to, if you've got a hammer, then everything's a nail. And if you're paid to have a hammer, then everything's even, you're further incentivized
right,
to see nails. And so there's, our society is structured in such a way where the incentive is to pathologize these things rather than to in any way say these are things that we as a society can change.
I think you put that brilliantly, Sam, because what we've done is we have depoliticized the pain caused by things like neoliberalism, right? So there were changes in the society that totally understandably and predictably made a lot of people feel a lot worse. And I want to stress that are real biological components, but by telling a story that is primarily or entirely biological, what we did is we depoliticized that pain. We depoliticized that signal. We actually cut people off from understanding, in many cases, why this was happening to them and why they felt so bad, and from fighting for the bigger solutions, right, for the better solutions. A lot of those people who have been given drugs, which have indeed taken off some of the edge of their pain, but we know from the long-term research of the chemical antidepressants, for most people don't solve it. And a lot of those people, what did they need? They needed a democratic workplace. They needed a universal basic income. They needed a ban on advertising that's designed every day to make us feel like shit. There's a whole range of factors. I also talk about more individual things that people can do. But if we don't understand what the signal is, we can't respond to the signal in a meaningful way. If you don't have an accurate map, you can't find your way through the territory. And what I'm trying to do in Lost Connections, my book Lost Connections, is redraw the map in line with the best scientific evidence. And this is one of the things that was really surprising to me. This isn't some kooky, fringe left-wing position. This is the position of the leading medical bodies in the world, the World Health Organization, the leading doctors at the United Nations. This isn't some... this has been well known for a long time. It's just not translated into how we've had our depression and anxiety explained to us. And so it's one of the reasons why we're in this disaster. We haven't been told the right story, and therefore we can't find the right solutions.
Okay, and I appreciate your hanging with me. I know I've held you for quite a while, but I just want to, before we go, because
I've got as much time as you need. Yeah,
all right. Well, and obviously, folks will pick up the book, but I want to talk about the disconnection from childhood trauma, just because that is one of those things that is ostensibly right outside of both the a biological imperative to suffer depression, and also outside of the way that society is structured, theoretically.
Yeah, so I find this one quite hard to talk about. The best way to explain it is to tell you a story. And if I tell you the story for a minute, you're going to think, why is he telling me this? This has nothing to do with depression, but I don't think people can understand it if they don't understand the story. It'll take about 3 minutes. Have you got
No, please go.
Great. So in the 1980s, in the mid-1980s in San Diego, a doctor called Vincent Felitti was approached by Kaiser Permanente, the big not-for-profit medical provider there, and given a quite difficult task. They said to Dr. Felitti, we've got this big problem. Obesity keeps going up and up every year, and nothing we're doing is dealing with it, right? We give people nutritional advice, it doesn't help. Even if we give them personal trainers, it doesn't make much difference. What can we do? So they gave him a quite big budget, and they said, just do blue skies research, go away, figure out what the hell we can do. So Dr. Felitti starts to work with 250 severely obese people who weighed more than 400 pounds. and people who've tried everything, and they're really at risk of dying. And he starts to work with them, and he's interviewing them. And one day he has an idea that seems, and in some ways is, quite stupid. He asked himself, what would happen if really obese people literally stopped eating, and we gave them like nutritional supplements, like vitamin C shots so they didn't get scurvy, stuff like that? Would they actually burn through the fat stores in their body and lose weight? So obviously with a shit ton of medical supervision, he starts to do that. And in one sense, initially, it worked. There's a woman who I'm going to call Susan to protect her medical confidentiality, who went down from being more than 400 pounds to 138 pounds, an incredible transformation, not untypical of the group. And her family is celebrating, she's celebrating, they're telling Dr. Felitti he saved her life. And then one day something happened that no one expected. Susan cracked, she went to KFC or whatever it was, she starts obsessively eating, and pretty soon she's back, not quite where she was, but at a dangerous weight. And Dr. Felitti calls her in and he's like, Susan, what happened? She looked down, she was really ashamed. She said, I don't know. And that was when Dr. Felitti started asking her some other questions that never occurred to him to ask. He said, it actually started by saying, well, tell me about the day you cracked. Did anything happen that day that didn't happen any other day? It turned out something had happened that day that had never happened to Susan. She'd been in a bar and a man had hit on her. Not in a horrible way, not in a predatory way, quite a nice way. But she'd felt really frightened and she just wanted to eat. That was when Dr. Felitti asked her, well, when did you start to put on your weight? In her case, it was when she was 11. He said, well, did anything happen when you were 11 that didn't happen when you were 9, didn't happen when you were 14, anything that year? And Susan looked down again and she said, yeah, that's when my grandfather started to rape me. Dr. Felitti interviewed everyone in the program. He discovered that 55% of them had put on their extreme weight in the aftermath of being sexually abused, which is such a higher proportion of the general population and seems so odd. He couldn't understand what was going on. Susan explained it to him really well. She said, overweight is overlooked, and that's what I need to be. He realized this thing that seems so irrational and is really bad for you, obesity, was performing a positive function. It was protecting them from sexual attention, which is something they needed and had very good reason to need. But this is a pretty small group. It's 250 people. It's hard to make big scientific conclusions based on that. So Dr. Felitti went to the Center for Disease Control and got a huge budget. Everyone who came for medical treatment to Kaiser Permanente in San Diego, didn't matter what for, headaches, schizophrenia, broken leg, anything, for a whole year, got given a questionnaire. The first part said, did any of these 10 bad things happen to you when you were a kid? Things like severe neglect, sexual abuse, physical abuse. And the second part asked, have you had any of these problems as an adult? Things like obesity, and then they added a load of other stuff at the last minute, depression, suicide attempts, addiction. When the figures were added up by the CDC, I interviewed some of the people, they were just like, there's some mistake here. For every category of childhood trauma you experienced, you were 2 to 4 times more likely to develop depression, anxiety, addiction. But when you got into the multiple categories, it just blew up. If you had 6 categories of childhood trauma, you were 3,100% more likely to have attempted suicide and 4,600% more likely to be an injecting drug user. I mean, these are just crazy figures. One of the scientists who worked on it, Dr. Robert Ander, said to me, it made him realize when you come across someone who's doing something that seems irrational, obesity, addiction, depression, we've got to stop asking what's wrong with you and start asking what happened to you. But the reason I talked about this being one of the really hard ones for me, if you met Dr. Felitti, you would really like him. He's a lovely, kind, good man. And I remember the first time I went to see him in San Diego, leaving the interview and shaking with anger. And walking on the beach of San Diego and thinking, why am I so angry with this really kind old man who's done all this good work? And it helped me to understand why for so many years I had remained stuck in this simplistically biological, why I'd been attracted to this simplistically overly biological story about my own depression. When I was a child, I had experienced some very extreme things over a long period of time from an adult in my life. I didn't want to think about this. I didn't want to give this individual any power over me as an adult. I just didn't want to think about it at all. But one of the reasons I'm glad that I stayed with this is because of what Dr. Felitti discovered next. So if you had indicated on your form that you had experienced some form of childhood trauma, your doctor was told, next time the patient comes in, don't call them back, but next time the patient comes in, say to them something like this: I see that when you were a child, you were sexually abused, or whatever the nature of the abuse was. I'm really sorry that happened to you. That should never have happened. Would you like to talk about it? And 40% of patients didn't want to talk about it, 60% did, and they wanted to talk about it on average for 5 minutes. It was then randomized. Some of them were told, we can refer you to a therapist to talk about this more. What's incredible is just those 5 minutes of an authority figure saying, I'm so sorry, this should never have happened to you. That alone led to a really significant fall in depression and anxiety. And the people who referred to a therapist had an even bigger fall. And this fits with a wider body of evidence from people like Professor Steve Cole at UCLA, Professor James Pennebaker at Florida State University, which shows it's not the trauma that destroys you. It's the shame about the trauma. For safe places to release that sense of shame and trauma is an antidepressant. But I think you can see in that story, for example, why what we've been doing, often with good intentions. Of course, there's issues about big pharma trying to maximize profit and all sorts of other things going on. But, most of the people who promoted this simplistically biological model, rather than acknowledging that biology is real and a contributor, but one of many factors, people who promoted that are mostly well-meaning, but you can see how harmful it is. Right. 13 years I was given very powerful drugs, right? I was told that this was just a problem in my brain, and nobody ever asked me, is there any reason you might feel this way? And don't get me wrong, I don't want to be simplistic about this. I'm not sure I would have been able to talk about those things then. I might have said no. But the fact that you tell people a story that focuses on a real but only one small part of this problem, you cut people off from understanding the deeper texture. And most importantly, one of the reasons I'm not depressed now is because I could release that shame, because I could learn that story. I could understand how that was playing out in my life. Now, I couldn't have done that if I hadn't been exposed to wonderful people who taught me that depression has wider cause, and anxiety and addiction have wider causes than just the biology. And this is a shift we have to make as a culture, because we've got to be honest. We've had 40 years of telling people just a biological story and doing nothing but drugging them while the society goes to shit. And where are we? Right? Every year the problem's got worse. It's not got worse because of the drugs. The drugs have taken the edge off for some people. But there's something wrong with that story, with that picture. What's missing from that story and that picture is most of what is causing this crisis in the first place.
Well, it's fascinating stuff. Johann Hari, the book is Lost Connections, Uncovering the Real Causes of Depression and the Unexpected Solutions. We'll, of course, put a link to that at majorityreportradio.com. It's fascinating stuff, Johann, and I really appreciate your sharing it with us today.
I love your show. I love the work you do all the time, Sam, and I'm really grateful to you for having me on. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Johann. All right, let's turn our attention to Dave Rubin was beating his chest about having a presidential candidate on his show the other day. And, I guess it hadn't occurred to me, but maybe we should have done more of we've got Bernie Sanders on the show. I mean, we interviewed Bernie Sanders on the show.
He's like a regular at this point.
You barely mentioned, you literally were like, oh yeah, and then also Bernie Sanders.
We have a special guest.
Right.
Yeah, you did say special guest.
But I realized, from a marketing standpoint, maybe...
one of the preconditions, though, Sanders said, don't make an issue of it.
Well, no, the last two times we've had Bernie on, half the comments are like, I thought this was going to be Michael.
Right.
Doing an impression.
Yes, that's so poorly executed that everybody thinks that there's a significant number of people
that it's a joke.
Genuinely think it's going to be a bit.
I will say this, though. Dave Rubin had a Democratic presidential candidate on. When I had a Democratic presidential candidate on, they did not feel obligated to talk to me like I was a child. And that's not a knock on, well, it's not a knock on anybody. It's not a knock on Dave or Marianne Williamson, because there was some things that Dave clearly didn't understand, and Marianne was explaining them to him.
Quite well.
And that's fine. That's not, that's just, I'm explaining a dynamic that's going on. And it'll be interesting to see how much Dave absorbs from these exchanges.
It's like
here.
tutoring.
Yeah, it is tutoring. And I thought she was very, very gentle with him about it. And
an ill-intentioned, dim-witted pupil that still needs endless patience.
Well, I mean, that's...
Oh, okay. Sorry. Don't suppress my
Which one are we
speech,
doing?
please.
10 or 11
Let's
first?
do a 10.
Okay, so here's the 10. Now, understand... Well...
They start talking about Dave's wants clarification about reparations.
Right. And...
he wanted a lot of clarification
right.
about this
Because
one. This one was definitely a
reparations-
trigger point.
Because we know that the specter of reparations is the source of all evil in our society right now. And with this hanging over us, not climate change or anything else, like reparations. Reparations and free speech on college campuses continue to be the most pressing issues in America today.
Historical
And here's-
restitution for racism
here's
and college.
Marianne Williamson.
The struggles, the sacrifices of any of our ancestors, black or white. I'm not saying we haven't done anything. The issue is, however, that point of economic restitution has never been made, and the legacies of that economic injustice have continued even to the point where now we're sliding backwards. Mass incarceration.
Pause it for
we're
1
sliding
second. I want to go back over this, but just to make sure that you understand what's going on here is Dave is saying, like, this is punishment for white people. And Marianne Williamson is saying, no, it's not punishment for white people, that the institution of slavery damaged a community. Really, it damages in two ways, right? There is a legacy amongst white people in the way that they view all black people, even if they were not descendants of slaves. This legacy permeates. We've talked to, what was it, The Roots of Prejudice? What was the name of that book? Where you can pick out on a county by county basis, you can do it this granular, and look at the ratio of slaves to white people in these counties and then predict how these counties are going to vote 200 years later. So the legacy continues on. Now, we can measure that with white people because they have had political expression throughout that time. We cannot measure it with the descendants of slaves in terms of their politics because they haven't had 200 years worth of a political voice. It's called Deep Roots, How Slavery Still Shapes Southern Politics. You can check that out. So with that, to see that it can be that specific, like you can actually measure actions that were a function of a ratio that existed hundreds of years before, broad themes that exist in society, of course they still remain.
I read that book.
Of course. I mean, we still hear stuff about the blood libel, right? I got news for you. If you look around society, stuff that happened 2,000 years ago still pretty much resonate, right?
Merry
Still
Christmas.
celebrating. Right, exactly. So that's on one side of the ledger. The other side of the ledger is the implications for people out of that community. When Social Security excluded African Americans as a bank shot by saying, we're going to look at different professions or jobs, I should say, that are dominated by African Americans or for women for that matter, and we're not going to provide Social Security there. It didn't matter if you were a descendant of a slave or not. When the FHA redlines in terms of what mortgages are going to be backed following World War II, they're not looking, are you a descendant of a slave? They're just looking at your, the social construct of race. And it has implications. We know that wealth builds over time through property. And so if you as a community, have not been able to gain wealth intergenerationally because for most of the generations that your folks have been in this community, haven't been able to accumulate wealth, it's going to resonate. So this is all just sort of like, it's there. Not to mention the psychic scars that exist regardless if you're a direct ascendant of a slave owner or a slave. So she's trying to explain this to Dave.
And she explains it to him about 8 different ways over the course of like 25 minutes.
Yeah, there's
so we're just taking out this one little segment.
Yeah.
Legacies of that economic injustice have continued even to the point where now we're sliding backwards. Mass incarcerations means we're sliding backwards. Racial disparity in criminal sentencing means sliding backwards. All these voter suppression acts, because the Voting Rights Act was chipped away at, we're sliding backwards. So for me, the issue of reparations, so first of all, this issue of atonement. I am a faith leader. This is what I've done for 35 years. So when I was doing ritualized apologies from white people to black, there is turbulence. There's turbulence under the waterline. You know, if you go to Germany, have you ever been to Germany?
No.
If you went to Germany 30 years ago, you really felt all the Holocaust guilt. And it's amazing how much has been flushed out now because of the generations that did the right thing. And that war was over in 1945. Civil War was over in 1865, and we are still at the effect of this underlying stuff that we move on from one generation to another.
But
so
do you think
when
there's
you apologize, I'm sorry.
Well, do you think there's a little bit of a risk in sort of, I mean, a couple of times you're referencing the genocide of the Jews to slavery. Seems like a little bit of a slippery slope there, no?
I don't even know how we can say that, actually, and I say that as a Jew. Have you read up much on slavery?
Yeah.
We're talking abject slavery, Dave. I mean, nobody's in a contest. Nobody has a monopoly on human suffering. This was abject slavery. And also, if you started slavery in 1619 and you had 2.5 years, 2.5 centuries, and then at the end there were 4 to 5 million enslaved people, do you realize generation after generation how many millions of people we're talking about?
Right. Well, I'm not diminishing that, but you can also talk about the extermination of 6 million people and the amount of people that never lived because of that would be alive. Or your ancestors from Russia who were never given anything and came here.
Well, wait a minute. But the Germans had paid reparations. That's kind of my point. The fact that Germany paid reparations, Germany has done full-on mea culpa. Germany has done full-on mea culpa. Nothing short of full-on mea culpa.
Okay, there's a lot to unpack here.
That's sort of can we just note that's sort of my point.
Exactly. Well, I mean, I don't know where to start here because this is a fascinating exchange in many respects. Like, I don't know what that means with a slippery slope. I mean, if you start comparing genocide to generations of slavery, now I don't know how religious Dave is, but every year my family gets around the table and we discuss the slavery that Jews went through 2,000 years ago. Well, actually, it was closer to 4,000 years ago, now that I think about it. 5,000. 5,678, I don't know what it is. Somewhere around there. 5,739. Long time ago. It's called Passover. We have a holiday to talk about that. There are broad implications that we make about that slavery. This is an intergenerational slavery we're talking about in this country that's only 200 and some odd years old. Not to mention, I would add that unlike in Germany, after the war, Marianne Williams is right. There has been a massive national effort over decades to internalize this mea culpa, to pay reparations. If you go to Israel, every taxi that you drive is a Mercedes-Benz. Every bus that you get on is a Mercedes-Benz. And that's because the German government basically sent a bunch of cars. I mean, there was other forms of reparations, yes, but I mean, it's just indicative. It's indicative of how public they wanted to make it too.
She also just really quick, I think, just as importantly in some respects, she also made the point of it being central in the education system as well.
Yes,
which is
without
also
a doubt,
her point.
without a doubt. And she says they've been able to expunge that. The slavery ended after the Civil War. The suppression, the government suppression of African Americans, I don't know where you draw that line. Is it, with anti-miscegenation laws? Is it, but certainly deep into the 20th century.
You wanted to make a purely legalistic
I'm talking
case,
legal,
which you shouldn't.
Right.
It would be 1964, 1965.
Right. Purely legalistic. Although there are states, though, where anti-miscegenation laws extended past that.
To the 90s.
But then you talk
On the
about
books.
policing, and she mentioned this about our criminal justice system, where there's sort of like institutional, not necessarily legal discrimination. And never mind societal. I mean, so this is an ongoing process, and maybe part of the reason why we haven't been able to sort of, and I don't know that we'll ever fully, but as a society, her argument is we need to have this to move on. We need some closure to be able to move on. That doesn't mean you just walk away from it, but also, we have incredible school segregation. I mean, we're talking about this. So she's just talking about this to Dave, and the idea, like, I'm not sure, where does the slippery slope go after slavery for a couple hundred years in this country? I mean, is it slippery slope to talk about Native American genocide? Or is it just that, like, if we provide reparations for the discrimination, the slavery, institutional, legalistic, for black people, do we have to do it for the Native Americans? And then if we do it for the Native Americans, what about Japanese internment? And my answer to all of these things is, yeah, why not?
Well, also, she pointed out, I believe, in the interview, and I was less familiar, that there has been some restitution to victims of the Japanese internment in the Reagan era of all times.
Yep.
And the Native Americans, to say the least. Are you kidding me? I mean, there's also present policy sets, just as with African Americans.
It's not necessarily a slippery slope. It's just like it's just a slope.
You want some more on the reparations conversation?
Yeah, let's just listen a little bit more. I mean,
We also just not lose sight of the fact here, though. These are really important, really deep things, and Dave is touched.
He's overloaded
in the head. He's overloaded by ideas.
It's almost like, now in my lifetime, I've certainly seen the ways in which racial issues have gotten better. But at the same time, you see how certain things are unwinding, almost getting worse. And so we need an integrated...
Yeah, that really feels right to you. That feels like a media makeup to me. I don't think racism... That's why I was so thrilled when I heard you make that statement. I don't think most Americans are racist.
Oh, I don't think most Americans are racist. But that's not my experience, it's not my belief. But what is my belief is that the average American is woefully undereducated about the history of race in the United States. And that's why I find this in very white states. I find it in New Hampshire and Iowa with people standing up applauding the idea. Why? Because I go through the timeline. 2.5 centuries of slavery. We're talking about abject slavery here. Then another 100 years of institutionalized violence. What do you call lynchings if not domestic terror? What do you call Ku Klux Klan if not domestic terror? Institutionalized white supremacy and segregation. This was violence perpetrated against the people. 350 years, because it was 100 years after the Civil War, before the Civil Rights Act. 350 years of institutionalized violence against the people, that's longer than our country has been in existence. So the idea of an economic restitution by the middle of the 20th century, this was considered just civilized behavior, and that is what advanced countries do. Do you worry that, as someone that comes from a sort of a spiritual healing side of this, that the collectivist portion on this, where we just sort of have an impasse, do you worry that sort of collectivist guilt makes people feel guilty about things that have nothing to do with them? And what the damage that could do to people that have literally nothing to do with it. We don't have to talk about this within a slavery context or a Holocaust context, but just sort of collectivism as a general rule, that it makes people attach emotions to themselves that have nothing to do with them as an individual. No, I don't, and that's never been my experience. I've been doing this for many years. People are smart, Dave. People are smart. There's no guilt there. I can't say I feel guilty personally. That's not what's happening. But I can see that my country this is a long and torturous relationship between blacks and whites in America. It goes back to the very beginning. And relationship is a journey between people and between peoples. And that journey of healing and journey of reconciliation makes a difference. Because Germany has done the right thing, you feel in a generation of young Germans so much guilt flushed out. Holocaust guilt has been flushed out. That's what we're talking about. We're ending the guilt. We're talking about getting past this torturous phase that's lasted for hundreds of years.
Right, but also in a weird way, then they opened up, because they have this sort of residual guilt still, they opened up their borders and let in 1.5 million people that then have sort of caused all sorts of other problems with integration and financially and everything else.
You just made a connection between those policies and leftover guilt from the Holocaust. I'm not sure every German or every German scholar or German politician would agree with you about.
Well, I don't think everyone would, but I think many would.
All right. So if I understand this, Dave does not want to have reparations because it will create guilt in people. And his evidence of that is that Germans feel guilty not because of the Holocaust, but because of the reparations, and therefore are letting in immigrants. So wait a second, is Dave arguing that Germany should not feel guilty? There should be no vestige of guilt at all whatsoever about the Holocaust?
Well, this is actually interesting because, of course, look, he's not bright and he's just fumbling
wait a
around
second.
here.
I don't care if he's not bright.
This is a serious... Okay, all right. I know you don't think that.
Right.
Excuse me. Pardon me. I happen to think that. I know you have utmost respect for Dave. But I think in right-wing right-wing circles that have like neoconservative arguments, actually, these polls are very strange. Because there is the first move he makes, which is that to even talk about another historical crime in the same context as the Holocaust is somehow offensive or wrong or cheapens
of course,
it. Right. And then there is this other thing, which is that people who actually are applying those lessons, whether it be to a refugee crisis or to upholding standards in Israel-Palestine, are liberal softheads who aren't like in the real world. So I actually see this argument on the right. It's totally contradictory, but I see this argument on the right a lot.
The middle argument that he's making is that it's unfair to people who were not involved.
Yes.
Because this collectivist reparations is going to implicate me, Dave Rubin, and I'm going to feel bad, and it's going to hurt me personally.
Well, and then the second part is, and then we'll support things like Syrian refugees, and that will be a danger to me now.
It's going to make us, it's going to make us react and do things that are too nice.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm not saying don't feel bad about the Holocaust. I'm just saying
it's a bad example to use Germany because he was just arguing moments ago that what they did was so bad that you can't even include slavery in the conversation.
Absolutely. But bear in mind, right-wing people who say never again have so warped it that they literally mean like never again, therefore no Syrian refugees.
Right. Specifically.
That's what they mean.
For me.
Me.
Right.
They don't mean it as a global standard of upholding basic humanity for everybody.
That exchange is fascinating, and I would like to. I wouldn't. It's impossible for me to imagine ever voting for Marianne Williamson, and I'm for president. But I would raise money to have her go around and talk to right wing. Yes,
yeah.
Honestly,
I think there's also. I just also think in this exchange, I think what's funny is I just saw, and I think Ronald Reagan pointed this out on Twitter. But apparently, Dave admits in the beginning of the interview that he didn't know who she was until the debate. So now I'm guessing that he clearly, and she didn't do great in the debate. I like her, but she didn't have a good performance. Clearly, he thinks like I get to pretend that I'm open-minded by having a Democrat on, and also maybe I could run circles around a dope from a debate. Oh, she's a lot infinitely smarter than you.
let's start. Yeah, let's start with Shapiro, and then we'll go back to the debates because this is pretty great. Now, since you've left, Matt, we developed a Dropbox for encrypted information for people to leak it to us. We don't talk about it a lot because, of course, we don't want the NSA to be aware of this.
I've been ignoring Laura Poitras's emails.
Exactly. And
we don't want to hear about that shit.
There's an intricate thing that involves you got to contact us on Signal. Then we send you a Proton email address, and then we send you a fob, which you insert into your computer. And then what happens is we end up finding these YouTubes of Ben Shapiro back on with Connie Martinson on Talks Books. This is from when?
2011.
2011.
I was here then.
And you were here then. I don't know how we didn't find this at that time, but Ben Shapiro.
Because I was here then.
Yeah, right.
Ben Shapiro, exactly.
Now the job is handled with a certain degree of competence.
And where are we picking this up from the very beginning?
Both on Mr. Ben Shapiro.
Yeah, we'll take this right from this top. I think.
Okay.
I guess there was a Ben Shapiro clip on
this
this ball.
Is Ben Shapiro on talking about his book about how Hollywood is chock full of liberals. And really the most interesting thing I found about this was that Ben Shapiro, like everybody else who came from Breitbart, was just mad that they did not have talent enough to break into Hollywood.
And I should shout out Some More News, Cody Johnston, who initially included part of this in his recent Ben Shapiro video.
Who knew he wanted to just write a lethal weapon vehicle?
Exactly.
Yeah. By the way, Connie ends up being very cool.
Yeah.
Where everybody's laughing.
She owns him before the BBC guy did.
Yes, this was the first one.
The true Hollywood story of how the left overtook your TV. Primetime propaganda.
Welcome to Connie Martinson Talks Books.
She's cool.
You watch a TV show and you start laughing, but afterwards, do you think about what maybe was said or what you've been really recommended to believe? My guest today, Ben Shapiro, has written Primetime Propaganda, the true Hollywood story of how the left has made our country, took over your TV, and it's published by Harper.
I love how she wins this.
Welcome, Ben.
Thanks so much for having me.
She's already laughing at him. I guess one has to think about things we've laughed at, but you seem to pinpoint the authors of those shows as being liberal Jews.
Well, not all of them. I mean, Susan Harris is not Jewish. There are plenty.
Nor is Gary Marshall.
Nor is Gary Marshall. I certainly don't say that all of them are Jewish.
Well,
There's of course a lot of Jews in Hollywood, but that's because there are a lot of Jews at the top of any industry. Jews happen to be very hardworking.
Pause it. Can we just pause it for a second? Seriously.
I don't like where this is going.
Wow, this is...
Yeah, if you actually set aside protocols of the elders, Zion actually had a lot of legitimate ideas about Jewish work ethic.
Jews work very hard. Right.
Jews happen to be very hardworking.
No. It isn't just that. They have a point of view that can be considered comic and humorous.
That's true. I mean, there's a unique brand of Jewish humor, and that's been true since the beginning. I mean, go back to your show of shows. Everybody in that writer's room is a New York Jew. And that's good. I mean, this is good stuff.
Stop writing
this
our
is not a rip
coattails,
on
Ben
Jews.
Shapiro.
I mean, that would be ridiculous. The point, and by the way,
But
one of the points I make in the book
yeah.
is that the people who write TV are incredibly talented. That they have a political agenda, but they're very talented.
Well, let me say, I've yet to know of too many conservatives, which is where you put yourself, who are funny. I mean, it has to do with a humor that is transferable to
This is the best.
everyday
This
living.
is the best.
I mean, I utterly disagree with that. I think there can be conservatives who are funny. Liberals may not find them funny.
All right.
I mean, okay, Ann Coulter for conservatives is funny. Okay, for liberals, she's not funny. Bill Maher for liberals, hilarious. For conservatives, not funny. Okay, there's
Well, that depends because you're using politics as the form of their humor. But
Bill Cosby is relatively conservative
today.
That's true.
Yeah, and no, even back then. That's the idea that conservatism is inherently unfunny is not true. It's that conservatives have abandoned the playing field of humor and narrative. I'll agree with you there. I think that they've totally run away from that.
So many.
You got to pull that. Conservatives have abandoned the playing field of comedy and humor.
Well, there's so many young comedians you read, they were obsessed with the classics, with Pryor, with Carlin, with staying up all night watching vintage Saturday Night Live. But then they were like, I'm not going to go into it, though, because I'm going to seed the battlefield comedy in the culture war.
Well, I got to say this.
That's totally the upshot of a passion for comedy.
Back when I was starting out as a stand-up, you'd hear a lot of guys and women who would come in, and you'd be late night at, Catch a Rising Star in the basement of some place in Cambridge, and people would say, like, I don't know, I feel like maybe I should just abandon the battlefield.
Did you ever say it to yourself, Sam? You're like, I don't even want to do this, but this is a vital part of the battlefield.
Did you ever say it to yourself?
I would say things to myself like, I feel like I want to get a job where I can get a consistent income, and then I was like, but I can't take the tent down in the encampment I've created on this battle.
Going AWOL from the battle of humor.
Who will do Gen X Andy Kaufman jokes that promote the leftist agenda?
Exactly. That actually was probably what I was saying, but go ahead.
Is not true. It's that conservatives have abandoned the playing field of humor and narrative. I'll agree with you there. I think that they've totally run away from the battle. But that doesn't mean that there's not the capacity within conservative thought to be funny.
You talk about having conceived of the plot for a TV series and worked with Lenny Goldberg. Mm-hmm. Was that a comedy? Was it sitcom? Was it drama?
It was more of a dramedy. It was based on Harvard Law School. It was a dramedy. I've written a couple comedies, kind of hour-long dramedies for spec script.
And have they been bought?
No, because and there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that it's hard to sell anything in this town.
Yeah, thank you.
Period. Regardless of political viewpoint. And the other is that, and especially a breakout series right from the get-go, right? I mean, it's hard to sell a spec script. You start as a baby writer. I mean, you know the process.
Yeah. Have you worked continually with Lenny Goldberg since?
Yeah, I worked with him for several months afterward, and then he got sidetracked with Unknown and with Blue Bloods on CBS and all of that.
I just want to understand the frame that he's there. He was working on me on all these failures, and then he got sidetracked because he got a job on a series. That was the sidetrack. He actually got hired as a professional writer, and I was not, and so he got sidetracked. He lost sense of he, in many respects, went AWOL in the war. He ceded the battlefield.
Is that like how
retreated to a paid job in writing drama?
He ceded the narrative by getting a full-time job at a prestigious show.
Is that like how Maron got sidetracked after Break Room Live?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
He got sidetracked with the podcast in his garage. That's why he was talking to Obama.
Yeah, exactly.
That's why we don't do the Break Room Live anymore.
He got sidetracked. I've had a lot of friends who have gotten so sidetracked by taking some type of big movie job or something. It's just a real shame to see that happen, where they lose their focus on me. So,
what I didn't understand is why he wanted to do that when we could have watched old clips of me on Spin City into eternity.
Break Room Live was just about to explode and be successful, and then he decided to get sidetracked by that other show that he's doing. So.
Yeah, like everything else in Hollywood, things go into development, and then they kind of get sidetracked. They go sideways for a while. So.
Well, do you think the book will help sort of open the door with him again?
No, that wasn't the point of the book, but he knew what was going on with the book. It was not a hit job on Leonard Goldberg. I treat him very well in the book. In fact, most of the people in the book I treat very well for the most part. I talk about how talented and brilliant they are. I talk about how great their shows are, which they are, and that's not a bad thing. I just point out that, look, I'm a legal realist. I'm a lawyer. I went to Harvard Law School. And in law, the idea there's an idea that was promulgated by the left in the 1960s called legal realism. What it was is the idea that your politics are going to come out in your interpretation of law. That is the same thing that's true in art. Okay, your politics are going to come out in your creation and interpretation of art. And that's one of the points of the book. The people who I'm talking to are not bad people. A lot of them are not. Some of them are not even doing it purposefully. Some of them are doing it purposefully. But it's coming out in their work. And the one thing, above all, that Hollywood does right now that is utterly despicable is that they keep people who are not of their political ilk out of the business, period, end of story. I have them on tape admitting this. I have high-ranking members of the WGA. I have high-ranking members of the Caucus for Producers, Writers, and Directors. I have high-ranking members of the DGA. I have people talking about this openly and recognizing that it occurs.
Now, pause it. Now, I got to tell you that I was in show business. I wrote I think probably off the top of my head, 8 to 10 scripts that were commissioned by every single major network that there is, some that were, and several of the cable networks. And almost the first question, you would give what they call sort of the elevator pitch, and then you would start to go into the characters as you go into these meetings. But before you would get to any of that, you would have to tell them what your voting record was.
What happened to those scripts?
They went sideways.
They went sideways. I mean, the people got sidetracked.
You know what it is. People get sidetracked.
A lot of these
sideways.
networks, AMC got very sidetracked. I had written a script for them, and then they just sort of pursued like The Walking Dead.
You know,
and they got sidetracked.
I would love to watch you. You know what? I would love to see you write an episode of The Walking Dead. That I would be the first episode.
No,
of that show I
I wrote exclusively comedies, and then what I would call dramedies, which is what we call comedies that are not funny.
Yeah. You know what I love about this is that okay, I didn't read this book obviously, but you know how like the Ben Shapiro we know now is like does not even have a modicum of like, well, I mean they're talented people. He's just like always a dick.
Right.
And so my interpretation is that this book obviously is a plea for a job. So he's calibrating like I got to get booked and talk with all the rubes and bitch about Hollywood and say that they're a bunch of unethical elitists ramming their culture down our throats, blah, blah. But at the same time, you guys are all really talented, and it would be great if I could get some work in a dramedy series. Right. Maybe I wouldn't have to write these stupid fucking books I started doing when I was 12.
Again, I think
he should have written a script about being a teen conservative prodigy. And the psychosis of that would have been a fascinating, dark, disturbing comedy.
That would have hit too hard at home. And, but again, this is something, if someone like Norman Lear, Norman Lear funded People for American Way, had he just established a $3 to $5 million endowment to periodically hire people like Ben Shapiro, keep them from actually feeling the resent that fuels their entire, new career as a conservative talker, I think we would be in much better shape. Like you could have saved millions of dollars of advocacy just by giving these guys a job and telling them, like, this is great stuff.
I barely even know what this show is, but when I first saw Andrew Breitbart, I was like, why the hell did they not just give him talk soup?
Right, exactly.
And he wouldn't be doing this. He would just be like, whoa, they caught up with Courtney Cox at the red carpet.
He's partly right, though. Like, art is always going to be a vehicle for ideology, and Hollywood certainly has an ideology. But of the numerous groups of people who've been kept out of Hollywood for their ideology, I'm going to guess he's not too concerned about the literal purges that happened of communists and people suspected of being communists.
No, that was cool.
She mentions that actually later in the interview. It's a good one. If you just search Primetime Propaganda on YouTube, it'll come up.
I'm from a 612 area code. Who's this? Where are you calling from?
Hi, this is Bullfrog.
Bullfrog. What's that?
Bullfrog.
Well, Bullfrog. Oh my gosh. Thank you so much. We love your the work you've done.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm always tickled when you guys comment on it.
It's amazing. Let's play a little bit just to remind folks of what we're talking about.
It's an incredible accomplishment.
This and so that we can get here. Go ahead. This, of course, is Bullfrog right here. Left is best. All right. So now that we have you on the phone, I may have a disagreement. Okay, pause it. Now that we have you on the phone, how did you? What did it start as? Like, did you first put together the audio, or did you have like a notion in your head? Like, how did it start?
Well, so like I've been listening to you for years and years, and I have all of these memories of different memes and inside jokes bouncing around in my head. And then DJ Danarchy had that Funhouse song come out, and I write music too as a hobby now, but excuse me. I just sat down one Friday night and like spent 8 hours or 10 hours going through old clips and episodes and picking out fun phrases and little things, and then kind of grouped them into something that seemed like they made a narrative, and then wrote some music and just kind of formed it into a kind of rhythmic speaking, as you could say.
Yeah. And then you did the animation.
Yeah, I had to teach myself how to do the animation because I had showed a few people the song, and I could see they were kind of confused trying to follow along, and I had this vision in my head of what was going on. And I basically just used like PowerPoint and iMovie to make an animation for it. And I added a bunch of little other inside jokes. Like my favorite little Easter egg in there is when you and Michael are talking about making new moves or whatever, and Michael's drinking Chablis.
Yep.
Which
That's
is
a reach. I remember that.
joke back from like the Occupy Wall Street era.
Yeah.
You were teasing him about being hungover coming in or something, and saying that he drank too much Chablis that night or something.
Yep.
I remember every time I would have a laminated copy of my pay stubs during the Chablis jokes. I was like, really?
The Chablis and the yoga, right?
I was drinking rainwater with 5 roommates.
Wasn't high quality Chablis. $2 Chuck. Oh yeah, no, I've noticed the Chablis all the time. I didn't even think that was I
remember that bullfrog. It's every part of this is. I mean, you literally can come up. There's new things that I notice every single time.
Yes, I still see new things that I am amazed by.
Yeah, this crowd never gets tired of art that's about us.
Glad it returns the rewards over and over.
Well, it really is a masterpiece, and I'm really I honestly I can't thank you enough.
I like all the Mathgate stuff in there because that was a different time.
The Mathgate thing was yes.
Thank you. I clip all of your reactions to it when I'm feeling down. I go back and watch you guys laugh.
No, it's hysterical. I also really, I mean, it's less. I guess it's less prominent, but I thought the Dave Rubin video you did as well was also masterful work.
No, can you not hear Michael? Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say I also think the Dave Rubin video you did was masterful.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. That was a fun little
that one,
thing
right?
while I was teaching myself how to animate.
So that's the one that begins with Damore and Rubin. And then it just left his best debate, Sam Cedar.
Hey, Dave, this is a very brave move on your part.
Oh, yeah.
Have you heard about the SJW nonsense on the...
Dave Rubin is going to absolutely need to be exposed.
Look, I encourage all of you to go fan trolling.
Fan trolling. I love that part.
Start kicking in.
There was a video, and then there was like 14 videos. So
oh my
a lot
God.
of people
Woolsey comes in.
made mixes of this.
Our friends, creative, awesome people on YouTube, it's basically everybody.
We got a ton. And here's another Debate Sam Cedar. Debate Sam Cedar.
Why don't you just run to your safe space, Dave?
Debate Sam Cedar. Debate Sam Cedar.
I love wait. I mean, I don't think it's a few more seconds. I'm being indulgent here, but there's the James Woolsey, David Cameron, like mashed up. Can't even describe it. It's
That's
good.
a random shot of me with Skrillex there too. That's a deep cut.
How those just
the Jesus
Google
image on
images.
that one is a
I
lot.
don't know, found it pretty easily actually.
Well,
Skrillex does have a similar energy, I gotta say, in terms of his persecution complex.
Gotta say, just can't thank you enough. Really, the hours of enjoyment that we have gotten from this, days, has been.
That's awesome.
Yeah,
I'm so glad. I'm so glad to hear that. That's great.
And thanks for not forgetting me, Matt, and even the elusive Brendan.
Yeah. also, just on top of everything else, as much as I like to watch you squirm, I'm one of those they people. So, in case you're worried about pronouns.
One of the they people?
Oh, got it.
They, them.
Yeah, I'm a they person.
Thank
How
you.
can we possibly use that word?
I don't know how to address you.
That is a real problem.
It's literally not a word.
Never
What's this
in
they?
history, except for the times that I've used it on Twitter, that someone referred to a person as they.
Someone pointed out that the great thing with Ben Shapiro is that there is literally always a tweet. So, like, there was...
we did that yesterday.
Well, no, about David Koch.
Oh, no.
There was one where he was like,
You ghouls, David Koch supported marriage equality.
which was like not really the point of why those of us were celebrating David Koch's death. And then, of course, there was and you know what's funny is, honestly, there is a part of me that I don't take offense to that. I think some people want to try to maintain some standards in general, and I don't have a problem with that. But Ben Shapiro immediately, of course, there's screenshots of like essentially like basically I'm happy Howard Zinn is dead. Hopefully, like the clock is like close on Chomsky too. It's like, all right, buddy. Just every single time with that kid.
It's horrible.
What a little bastard.
Well, Bullprog, again, thank you so much. I'm so glad you called in.
They are an asshole, Ben Shapiro.
I really am so excited to know how you you conceived of that, at least. I mean, that process is fascinating to me, that it was just basically the way that you grouped that together.
Also inspirational, kids. If you want to learn technical skills, you can do it.
Yes.
You could be an autodidact.
Well, thanks so much.
I actually, really quick,
Bullprog.
Bullprog, and for all creative people out there, Kyle Kolinsky the other day shared with me a 2014 Dave Rubin on TYT defending the Israeli bombardment of Gaza. I'll just say that clip's one of the funniest things I've seen in quite some time. Like, if the content was not so disturbing, watch Dave basically clearly talking about the only subject area that he actually cares about, which is defending Israel, and just being completely... There's one part where he's just like, I know we don't trust the government and stuff, but maybe this is one time where we do trust them, that Hamas started it. And he just looks like such a dope.
All right, appreciate the call.
Better with the beard, Dave. I'll give him that. Definitely an upgrade.
Thanks.
He's just got this big vacant look on his face, and he's just literally just like, yeah, no, I know that we should like bomb schools and stuff, but I mean, maybe, the Israelis are trying. It's actually beautiful because it's just like the libertarian stuff. It's just like the distilled essence of what everybody says when they defend Israel, just pared down to raw stupidity.
Yeah, without any of this
no
sort of like accoutrements. Yeah. Call from.
It might take all the strength I got to get to where I want, but I know somehow I'm gonna get there. I wasn't looking when I just got caught.